Are you a bad man? Because I need one. That was the first thing I heard before I ever saw her. A small voice cutting through the polished silence of the marble lobby like it didn't belong there, like it had slipped in from a different world entirely. And when I turned, I expected trouble, maybe a setup, maybe someone's mistake, but instead I saw a little girl standing alone in shoes that were too worn for a place like this, her coat thin, her fingers curled tight around the edge of it, as if holding herself together, and for a second, just one, I didn't move, because men like me don't get approached, not like that, not without fear, but she wasn't afraid, or maybe she didn't understand what I was, and somehow that made it worse, made something shift in the air that even my security detail felt without saying a word, because they all went still, waiting for me to react, and I studied her the way I study everything, quietly, precisely, looking for angles, for lies, for anything that didn't add up, but there was nothing calculated. In her eyes, just exhaustion that didn't belong to someone her age and a kind of quiet urgency that pressed against my chest in a way I couldn't explain. And when I finally stepped closer, the sound of my shoes echoing across the floor, she didn't back away, didn't flinch, just tilted her head up like she'd already decided I was the answer, like she didn't have time to be wrong. And I found myself asking, softer than I intended, "Where's your parent?" But she shook her head immediately like that question didn't matter, like it wasn't the right one. And then she said it, simple, direct, like a fact she'd repeated too many times already. "My mommy is sick, and her boss said she doesn't deserve to be paid." And something in my chest tightened, not anger, not yet, something colder, something sharper, because I've heard a lot of things in my life, seen people beg for money, for mercy, for protection, but this wasn't that. This was a child trying to understand why the world didn't work the way it was supposed to, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't have an immediate answer. So instead I asked the only question that mattered, the one that would tell me whether this was a problem I needed to solve or ignore. "What's your mother's name?" And when she answered, her voice smaller now, like she was finally starting to feel the weight of where she was, I saw one of my men shift slightly in my peripheral vision, already moving, already making calls without being told, because they knew me well enough to recognize the change, the moment when something crossed a line I don't allow to be crossed. And I exhaled slowly, my gaze still on the girl, memorizing every detail, the way her hands trembled just enough to notice, the way she stood her ground anyway. And I realized this wasn't about kindness. It never is. It was about balance, about correcting something that had tipped too far in the wrong direction. And as the lobby returned to its quiet hum around us, like nothing unusual was happening, I made a decision without saying it out loud, because I didn't need to. I never do. And when I looked back down at her, I kept my voice even, controlled, the way it always is. But there was something else beneath it now, something that hadn't been there a minute ago. "All right," I said. "I'll take care of it." And she blinked up at me like she didn't fully understand what that meant, like she couldn't yet see the chain reaction already in motion, the calls being made, the names being pulled, the quiet unraveling of someone else's bad decision. And for a brief second, just before one of my men stepped forward to guide her somewhere warm, I wondered how many times she'd had to say those words before someone finally listened, and the answer didn't sit well with me at all. I have learned that silence moves faster than shouting, and within 3 minutes of her saying her mother's name, my phone vibrated once in my pocket, a single signal that meant everything I needed was already unfolding. And I did not check it immediately, not yet, because the girl was still standing in front of me like she had used the last of her courage just to get here, and I was not about to waste that moment by looking away. So instead I crouched slightly, just enough to meet her at eye level without making it obvious to anyone watching, and I said, "What is your name?" And she answered, "Lily," like it was something small, something that did not matter compared to everything else pressing on her world, and I nodded once, committing it to memory the same way I remember numbers, accounts, debts, things that do not disappear. And then one of my men stepped close enough to speak without being heard, his voice low, controlled. "We found her, Emily Carter, 32, works hourly. No recent payments in 8 weeks. Employer flagged multiple complaints." And I did not react outwardly, not a single change in posture or expression, but inside something settled into place, cold and precise. Because there is a difference between a mistake and a pattern, and this was not a mistake. And I asked one more question, still looking at Lily. "Is your mother at home?" And she nodded quickly, relief flickering across her face like she had been waiting for permission to hope, and I stood back up slowly, adjusting my cuff as if this were just another conversation in a long day, while around me the lobby resumed its quiet rhythm, people passing, conversations continuing, no one noticing that a decision had just been made that would rearrange someone else's entire week, and I said, "You are going to wait here for a moment," my tone leaving no room for argument, and she obeyed without hesitation. Because children understand certainty even when they do not understand power, and as I turned away, my men moved with me, forming a quiet perimeter. That looked like routine to anyone who did not know better, and I finally glanced at my phone, reading the brief report that confirmed what I already expected: delayed wages, ignored requests, a supervisor who had signed off on everything like it was nothing more than paperwork, and I exhaled once, slow, controlled, because I have built an empire on people keeping their word, on systems that function because someone enforces the line between what is allowed and what is not, and this crossed that line in a way I do not tolerate, and I said, "Get the address." And it was already done before I finished the sentence, because efficiency is not optional in my world. And as we moved toward the exit, I paused just long enough to look back at Lily, still standing exactly where I left her, her small hands clasped together, like she was holding on to something invisible. And for a moment, I wondered how long she had been carrying this alone, how many doors had stayed closed before she walked into mine, and I gave a slight nod to the woman at the front desk, a silent instruction that was understood immediately: warm drink, a place to sit, someone to stay with her, all handled without questions. And then I stepped outside into the cool air, the city stretching out in front of me like a system waiting to be corrected. And as the car door opened and I slid inside, I did not think about whether I should be doing this, because that question never applies to me. I only decide how far it goes. And as the engine started and we pulled into traffic, I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else, "No one decides she does not deserve to be paid." And the city kept moving, unaware that somewhere between one streetlight and the next, the balance had already begun to shift. The building did not look like the kind of place where decisions ruined lives, which is exactly why it worked: clean glass, polished floors, a reception desk that smiled too easily, everything designed to suggest order, fairness, professionalism. And I stepped inside without slowing down, my presence shifting the air in a way that did not need to be announced, because people notice patterns before they understand them. And conversations softened as I passed. Eyes flickered, posture adjusted, instinct doing what logic could not explain. And I did not look at anyone directly until I reached the desk, where a woman greeted me with the kind of rehearsed warmth that disappears the moment something goes wrong. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" And I placed a single folder on the counter, not opening it, not sliding it forward, just letting it exist between us like a question she did not yet know how to answer. And I said, "I am here about Emily Carter," and the name alone was enough to create a pause, subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it, the slight tightening around her eyes, the quick glance toward the back offices, the way her smile held for just a second too long, and she replied, "You will need to speak with management," as if this were routine, as if this were something that could be delayed, redirected, minimized, and I nodded once, because that was exactly where I intended to go. And within moments I was walking down a hallway lined with framed certificates and mission statements that talked about integrity like it was a decoration instead of a requirement. And when the office door opened, the man inside stood halfway out of his chair, confusion first, then recognition of something he could not name but did not like, and I did not introduce myself. I did not need to. I simply closed the door behind me and took a seat across from him like I belonged there more than he did. And for a moment neither of us spoke, because silence is weight when you know how to use it. And then I slid the folder across the desk, opening it just enough for him to see the numbers, the dates, the pattern that told a story he could no longer control. And I said, "Calm, even, 8 weeks." And he blinked, once, twice, searching for the right response, the right excuse, something that would reframe this into something smaller, manageable. "There must be a misunderstanding," he began, and I stopped him with a single look, not anger, not aggression, just certainty, the kind that does not bend, and I leaned back slightly. giving him space to understand the position he was in without raising my voice, because volume is unnecessary when the outcome is already decided. And I continued. You decided she did not deserve to be paid. Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact placed on the table where it could not be moved. And he swallowed, his hands shifting on the desk as if they might find control there. She missed shifts. There are policies. We have procedures. And I let him finish, because people reveal everything when they think they still have time. And when he was done, I nodded once, acknowledging the effort, and then I said quietly, policies do not erase responsibility. And that was the moment it changed, the moment he understood that this was not a conversation about paperwork, not something that would end with a signature and a delay. This was correction, immediate and absolute. And I reached forward, tapping the folder lightly. You will pay what is owed, I said, each word measured, deliberate, today. And the room felt smaller after that, like the walls had shifted closer without moving. And he hesitated, just enough to confirm everything I needed to know about him. And I added, softer now, almost conversational, and you will make sure it never happens again. And I stood before he could respond, because the decision had already been made. And as I walked toward the door, I paused just long enough to say the only thing that mattered, the line that would stay with him long after I left. Next time, you decide who deserves to be paid. Remember that someone else might decide what you deserve. And then I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, where everything looked exactly the same as before, clean, calm, controlled, except now it was not, because somewhere behind me, a man was realizing that the system he relied on had just been rewritten without his permission, and outside, the city kept moving, unaware that a balance had just been corrected in a quiet office on the third floor. By the time I reached the street, the outcome was already in motion, not because I forced it, but because pressure applied at the right point does not need to be repeated. And as the car door closed behind me, my phone vibrated again. A second update, confirmation without explanation, the kind I expect, and I read it once before looking out at the passing traffic. Payment processing, full amount, additional compensation approved. And I nodded slightly, because that was the minimum correction required, not generosity, not kindness, just balance restored to where it should have been from the beginning. And I said, send a doctor, not raising my voice, not looking away from the window. And the response came immediately, already arranged, because efficiency is not impressive, it is expected. And as the city blurred past in reflections of glass and steel, I found myself thinking about the apartment we were heading toward, the kind of place that holds more worry than furniture, where every bill sits heavier than it should, where time stretches longer when someone is sick and there is no one to call. And I have seen those places before, more times than I can count, but I do not stop for all of them. I cannot. That is not how my world works. And yet this one was different. Not because of the situation, but because of the way it was brought to me, direct, unfiltered, without fear or negotiation. And when the car finally slowed, pulling up to a building that had seen better years, I stepped out without waiting. The air cooler here, quieter, like the city had forgotten this block on purpose. And one of my men moved ahead to open the door, but I waved him back, just slightly, because some moments do not need an audience, and the hallway smelled faintly of old paint. And something medicinal, the kind of scent that lingers when illness stays too long. And I climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, each step measured, controlled, until I reached the door with the number we had been given, and for a second, just one, I paused, not out of hesitation, but to listen, because silence tells you more than noise ever will. And I could hear it, faint, uneven breathing, the kind that comes with exhaustion more than anything else. And I knocked once, not loud, not soft, just enough to be heard. And when the door opened, it was not Emily who stood there, but Lily again, her small face lifting with recognition that arrived faster than disbelief, like she had already decided I would come. And I did not smile. I rarely do. But I lowered my voice slightly when I said, I told you I would take care of it. And she stepped back immediately, letting me in without question, because trust, once given like that, does not come with conditions. And inside, the apartment was exactly what I expected, simple, worn, but clean in the way people try to hold on to control when everything else is slipping. And on the couch, Emily lay half awake, her eyes opening slowly as I entered, confusion first, then concern, then something else when she saw the men behind me who did not need to say a word to be understood, and I stopped a few feet away, not too close, not imposing, just present, and I said, calm, steady, your employer has corrected their mistake, and she blinked, trying to process words that did not fit into the reality she had been living in for weeks, and before she could respond, one of the doctors stepped forward quietly, setting a bag down with practiced ease, and I turned slightly toward the window, giving them space, because this part was not about me. It never was. And as Lily moved closer to her mother, her small hand finding Emily's without hesitation, I realized something simple, something that does not change no matter how much power you have. Sometimes the only thing that matters is that someone showed up when no one else did, and I stood there for a moment longer, just long enough to see the shift, the subtle change in the room where tension loosened and something steadier took its place. And then I stepped back toward the door, because my part in this was already finished, and I do not stay where I am no longer needed. There is a moment when a room changes, not because of what is said, but because of what is no longer feared, and I felt it before I reached the door, the subtle shift in the air as the doctor spoke in a calm, steady tone, explaining things that should have been explained days ago. Simple words, manageable steps, nothing dramatic, just clarity where there had been uncertainty, and I paused with my hand near the handle, not turning it yet, because I have learned that leaving too quickly can undo what presence creates. And behind me, I heard Emily's voice, weaker than it should have been, but grounded now, less strained. Wait, she said, not loud, but enough to stop me, and I turned back slowly, giving her my full attention without moving closer, because distance matters when someone is still trying to understand who you are, why you are there, and what it cost. And she pushed herself up slightly, Lily immediately at her side, steadying her without being asked, and there was something in that small movement that caught my attention, the way the child adjusted instinctively, like she had done it before, more than once, and Emily looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, the kind that does not settle easily. Why would you do this? She asked, her voice careful, like she was choosing each word before letting it go, and I did not answer right away, not because I did not have one, but because most answers people expect are not the ones I give, and I stepped a fraction closer, just enough that she would not have to strain to hear me, and I said, because it needed to be done, simple, direct, without decoration, and she studied me like that was not enough, like she was searching for something softer, something that made more sense in her world, and maybe she was right to look for it. But I have never been interested in being understood, only in being precise. And Lily looked between us, her small hand still holding her mother's. And then she asked the question that adults always hesitate to say out loud. Are you going to go away now? And I looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she stood a little straighter than she should have, the way her eyes carried more weight than they were meant to, and I nodded once, because honesty is the only thing that holds in moments like this. Yes, I said, and she absorbed that without arguing, without pleading, just a quiet acceptance that told me more about her life than any report ever could. And I reached into my coat, not rushing the movement, not making it feel like a transaction, and placed a simple card on the table beside them. Nothing elaborate, just a number written clearly. And I said, if anything like this happens again, you call. Not a suggestion, not an offer, a condition set in place where there had been none before. And Emily followed the card with her eyes, then looked back at me, something steadier forming in her expression now, not just gratitude, but recognition, the understanding that this was not random, not temporary. This was a line that had been drawn for her whether she asked for it or not. And I turned then, finally opening the door, because staying longer would only complicate what was meant to be simple. And as I stepped into the hallway, the quiet settling back around me, I heard Lily's voice again, softer this time, almost to herself. He did not even wait. And I paused for half a second, just enough for the words to reach me fully, before continuing down the stairs, because she was right. And in my world, the only thing worse than doing nothing is waiting too long to do something that should have been done immediately. The city did not change when I left that building. It never does. Traffic still moved in. Steady lines. Lights still shifted from red to green. People still walked past each other without looking twice. And yet I could feel the difference. Not around me, but in the quiet space where a decision had already settled into place. And as I stepped back into the car, the door closing with a soft, final sound, one of my men glanced at me through the rearview mirror, waiting for the next instruction that always comes, the next name, the next correction, because in my world there is always something unfinished. But this time I did not speak right away. I simply looked out the window as the car pulled into motion, watching the reflection of buildings slide across the glass like something temporary. And after a few seconds he asked carefully, "Do you want us to keep an eye on them?" And I considered that, not because it was a difficult decision, but because every action creates a line that did not exist before. And lines matter. They define what is yours and what is not. And I finally said, "Yes, but not visibly." Because protection that feels like control is not protection at all. And he nodded once, understanding immediately. No further explanation needed. And the car moved faster now, merging into the rhythm of the city as if nothing had happened, as if no balance had been restored just minutes ago. And I leaned back slightly, closing my eyes for a moment, not out of fatigue, but to replay something that did not fit as easily as the rest, the way Lily had looked at me, not with fear, not even with relief, but with expectation, like she had already decided I would do something before I had even spoken. And that kind of certainty is rare. It does not come from logic. It comes from necessity, from reaching a point where there is no other option left. And I have built my life making sure people never reach me by accident, that they come through layers, through distance, through decisions that filter out anything unpredictable. And yet she had walked straight through all of it with a single sentence. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself thinking about that more than the outcome, more than the correction itself. And when my phone vibrated again, I opened my eyes and checked the message, a simple confirmation, funds delivered, receipt acknowledged. And I locked the screen without responding, because there was nothing left to say. Everything that needed to happen had already happened, and still, something remained, not unfinished, just unfamiliar. And I said quietly, almost to the passing city outside, "Make sure the job is still there when she returns, because money solves the immediate problem, but stability is what keeps it from coming back." And my driver adjusted the route without being told, turning onto a street that would take us back toward everything waiting for me, meetings, decisions, responsibilities that do not pause. And as we moved further away, I realized something simple, something that does not change no matter how far you go or how much you control. Sometimes the smallest voice is the one that shifts everything, not because it is loud, but because it refuses to be ignored. And I do not ignore things that matter, not anymore. The next morning started like every other one in my world, structured, precise, already moving before most people opened their eyes. But something lingered from the night before, not distraction, not hesitation, just a quiet awareness that sat beneath everything else. And as I stepped into the office, glass walls catching the early light, my assistant handed me a tablet without a word, knowing I would want the updates before I asked. And I skimmed the information quickly. Numbers, confirmations, adjustments already executed, Emily Carter's account stabilized, medical care scheduled for the week, employment status secured with a formal apology documented in writing. Everything aligned exactly as instructed, and I set the tablet down with a small nod, because that is how it should be, clean, complete, without loose ends. But then I paused, just for a second, because one detail stood out. A note flagged at the bottom. Child waited at front desk for 23 minutes before departure. Declined transport twice. And I read it again, slower this time. Not because it was unclear, but because it was unexpected, and I asked, "She stayed?" And my assistant nodded. "Yes, she said she wanted to make sure you came back." And I leaned back slightly, considering that, the patience it takes for a child to sit in a place that does not belong to her, surrounded by people she does not know, holding on to a decision she cannot control. And I exhaled once, quiet, controlled, because that kind of trust is not something I take lightly. And I said, "Send something." And my assistant waited, because vague instructions are not how I operate. And I clarified, "Not money, something she will keep." And within seconds options appeared, efficient, appropriate, but none of them felt right, not because they were wrong, but because they were impersonal. And I dismissed them with a small gesture, deciding instead without explanation, because some things do not require discussion, And the rest of the morning continued as expected: meetings, decisions, voices that rose and fell in controlled patterns. But every now and then, between conversations, I found myself thinking about a small pair of worn shoes standing on polished marble, about a voice that did not belong in that space but changed it anyway. And by early afternoon, the package was ready. Simple, deliberate, not extravagant, not symbolic in any obvious way. Just something chosen with intention rather than convenience. And I held it for a moment before handing it off, because intention matters more than cost. And I said, make sure she gets it directly. Not through layers, not through explanation, just delivered the way her words had been delivered to me. And as the day moved forward, returning to its usual rhythm, I realized something I had not considered before: that sometimes the smallest disruptions are not disruptions at all. They are corrections, reminders of lines that should never have been crossed in the first place. And as I stood by the window, looking out at a city that continued to move without noticing any of it, I understood that this was not about what I had done. It was about what I would not allow to happen again. And that difference, quiet as it was, changed more than anyone would ever see. By late afternoon, the city had settled into that quiet tension between movement and exhaustion, the kind that only shows up when people have been carrying too much for too long. And somewhere across it, in a small apartment that had felt heavier just the night before, something had shifted in a way that no report could fully capture, and I did not need to be there to know it, but I chose to know anyway. Because understanding the result matters as much as creating it. And when the confirmation came through that the package had been delivered, I did not open it immediately. I let it sit for a moment, because anticipation tells you things that information does not. And when I finally looked, it was simple, exactly as intended, delivered directly, child present, reaction positive, no embellishment, no unnecessary detail, just the outcome. And I allowed myself a brief pause, imagining the scene not as a report, but as it must have been: Lily opening the door, the same way she had the night before, cautious but steady, the way children learn to be when life teaches them too early that nothing is guaranteed, and the package placed in her hands, not explained, not justified, just given. And I wondered if she had understood it immediately, not the object itself, but the meaning behind it, that someone had remembered, that someone had followed through without being asked again. And that matters more than anything you can put inside a box. And I stood by the window again, the same view, the same city, but not the same perspective, because once you allow something to matter, even slightly, it changes how you see everything that follows. And I heard my assistant approach before she spoke. There is something else, she said carefully, and I turned just enough to acknowledge her without breaking the moment entirely. And she continued, the employer requested a meeting. They want to make sure everything is resolved. And I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable. People always want reassurance after they have been reminded of consequences. They want to confirm that the line has been redrawn in a way they can understand. And I shook my head once, slow, deliberate. No meeting, I said, because clarity does not need repetition. And she nodded, already noting the decision, already moving on to the next task. Because in my world, once something is settled, it stays that way. And as she left, I returned my attention to the city, watching as the light shifted lower, casting longer shadows across buildings that looked permanent but were not immune to change. And I thought about something simple, something that does not show up in reports or numbers, that sometimes the most important part of power is not how it is used, but when it is used without hesitation, without delay, without waiting for permission. And I understood then why her words had stayed with me, why they had moved through everything else without resistance. Because she had not asked for help the way people usually do. She had simply stated a truth and expected it to matter. And for once, it had. And as the evening began to settle in, I realized that somewhere across the city, a child who had walked into a place she did not belong now had something different to hold on to. Not just relief, not just safety, but proof, quiet and steady, that sometimes the world does respond when you speak. And that was not something I intended to take lightly. Some endings do not arrive with noise or celebration. They settle quietly into place, almost unnoticed, like a door closing without a sound. And a week later, that is exactly how it felt. Not like something had happened, but like something had been corrected so precisely that the world no longer needed to react to it. And I did not think about it every hour, not even every day, but it remained steady, present in the background of everything else. And when the update came through that Emily had returned to work on her terms, with her position intact and her pay current, I read it once and set it aside, because that was the expected outcome, not an achievement, not an exception, just the way things should function when no one interferes with what is right. And still, later that evening, as the city lights reflected across the glass walls of my office, my phone vibrated with something that was not part of any report, not part of any system I controlled. And for a moment I let it ring. Because unfamiliar things are rarely urgent in my world. But something about it made me pick it up anyway, and when I answered, there was silence for a second, just enough to recognize the hesitation on the other end. And then a small voice said, "It is Lily." And I did not speak immediately, not because I was surprised, but because I understood what it meant for her to call, that she had kept the number, that she had waited for the right moment instead of using it without reason. And I said, "Yes," simple, acknowledging, and she continued, her voice steadier than before, but still carrying that same quiet weight. "My mommy went back to work today, and I could hear something else beneath it, not relief. Not exactly, something closer to certainty, like she was confirming a result she had already believed would happen." And I leaned back slightly, looking out at the city that never paused long enough to notice moments like this, and I replied, "Good, because there are times when anything more would only complicate what should remain clear." And there was a pause. Again, softer this time. And then she asked, "Do you always fix things that fast?" And I considered that, not as a question, but as a reflection of what she had seen, what she had learned from a single interaction, and I answered honestly, "The only way that matters, no." I said, "Only the things that should have never been broken." And she did not respond right away, and I could almost picture her processing that, the way children do, turning simple words into something they can carry forward. And then she said, quietly, "Okay," like that was enough, like she did not need anything more, and the line went silent after a soft goodbye. And I lowered the phone slowly, not rushing to put it away, because some moments are not meant to be dismissed immediately. And as I stood there, the city stretching out in front of me, I understood something that does not change no matter how much power you have or how far you go. That control is not defined by how many things you can move, but by knowing which ones you must and which ones you refuse to ignore. And somewhere across the city, a small voice that had once stood alone in a place it did not belong now carried something different, something steady, something that would not fade easily. And I did not need to see it to know it was real, because sometimes the only proof you need is that someone believed you would not wait, and you did not.